The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from a non-governmental panel of expert witnesses to examine the terrorism threats posed by jihadist groups in Africa and their implications on U.S. homeland security and our interest. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence. We're holding this important hearing to examine and discuss the rising threats posed by terrorist groups in Africa and its impact on the security of our homeland and Americans abroad. This is a topic of critical importance, not only to this committee and this subcommittee, but also, I think, to our entire country. In fact, it was this subcommittee that held the very first congressional hearing about Boko Haram, who refers to itself as the Nigerian Taliban, and has been designated a foreign terrorist organization for its terrorist attacks. Why are we here? Over 30 years ago, terrorists trained at an al-Qaeda training camp. Terrorists who were trained at an al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan carried out a car bombing at the World Trade Center. The bombing resulted in the deaths of 6 people and injured thousands of Americans. 8 years later, 19 terrorists that were motivated by the same radical ideological beliefs hijacked 4 commercial airliners and carried out the largest terrorist attacks on American soil on September 11th. And just a short while ago, Homeland Security Committee members led by Subcommittee Chairman Anthony D'Esposito commemorated the 22nd anniversary of those attacks on 9/11 at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in Lower Manhattan. Members honored the memory of the victims and thanked the first responders for their dedicated services. During the period between the first attack on the World Trade Center and 9/11, our nation did not fully comprehend the threats posed by the Salafi jihadist movement or identify the warning signs or threat indicators that could have helped degrade al-Qaeda's operational capacities and capabilities. We must learn from these past gaps, some would call them failures, and have proactive conversations to not only identify these threats, but appropriately confront them before they metastasize. Political instability, dire economic conditions, sectarian violence, mass migration, and an anti-Western sentiment are just some of the main factors that contribute to individuals radicalizing and joining jihadist movements to commit violence. The unfortunate reality is that many African nations share these underlying factors that contribute to the rise of extremism. These conditions are not new and have been present on the continent for decades. 2 notable events have especially defined today's terrorism threat landscape throughout Africa. First, on October 3rd, 1993, American forces helping with U.S. peacekeeping operations in Mogadishu were attacked by Somali National Alliance, whose fighters were trained and equipped by al-Qaeda. 18 Americans died and 73 others were injured. To this day, the Battle of Mogadishu is still one of the deadliest days in the history of the U.S. operations, special force operations. American forces were again attacked by jihadists on October 4th, 2017 in Niger. Now known as the Tongo ambush, U.S. Army special operators and Nigerian troops were ambushed by Islamic State militants while out conducting an operation to capture Islamic State in the Greater Sahel commander Dawandu Shafau. 4 Americans and 4 Nigerians were killed that day, and 8 Nigerians and 2 Americans were wounded. Both the Battle of Mogadishu and the Tongo ambush were galvanizing inflection points for the jihadist movements in Africa and helped contribute to the rise of the terror networks across the continent. Regional instability has also fueled the terror threat landscape across Africa. After the collapse of ISIS caliphate in Syria and Iraq, many of the jihadists escaped to various countries throughout Africa. These insurgents have wreaked havoc across the continent, forcing governments to develop and enhance their counterterrorism capabilities. Our nation has helped lead these efforts. In fact, we have kept 2 bases in Niger with about 1,000 men and women of our military deployed there with counterterrorism and an intelligence mission across the broader region. However, near-peer competitors, both China and Russia, have also rushed to help fill this power vacuum. Russia has exploited corrupt African governments with checkered human rights records into allowing their nation's counterterrorism, quote-unquote, counterterrorism efforts to be supported by Russian paramilitary groups. Most notably, Russia's Wagner Group, a private military company, have not only provided counterterrorism capabilities, but have also been used to prop up ruthless authoritarian figures. In return, Russian PMCs gain access to gold, to diamonds, critical mineral mines, and many other resources. And these resources have helped keep the Russian economy afloat and has helped fuel their unjust and provocative war in Ukraine. The nefarious actions and human rights abuses by foreign malign nation states have turned local populations towards jihadist groups for protection. The United States cannot continue to allow Russian PMCs or CCP groups to fill this power vacuum. We must provide viable alternatives to these arrangements and encourage our African partners to work with us and embrace our shared democratic values to stop the spread of the jihadi movement. This hearing today is an important subject that I'm personally familiar with, having served myself in the Middle East, having served in operations against ISIS throughout Iraq and Syria. I know firsthand just how deadly these periods of time can be when you have the ability for these groups to grow unchecked and to not have the appropriate partnerships abroad. Our African partners must not fall victim to the sheer brutality of these jihadist groups or allow anywhere on the continent to become a new breeding ground for extremism. I hope today that we can have an open and an honest dialogue on this issue. This is not a partisan issue. This has nothing to do with Republican versus Democrat politics. This is all about the security of the United States. It's all about the security of our partners who value freedom, who value the Western mentality of pushing back on groups that would harm not only our partners, but the innocent lives of so many people throughout the world. We're absolutely delighted to have a distinguished panel with plenty of experience to give us your thoughts and your recommendations as to where we should go. And lastly, I'll say, you think about these hearings and what they mean to our country. And even though some of these don't get the press or the publicity, they are vitally important for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to hear the facts. We cannot allow these interim periods of time in between conflicts like what 9/11 brought to this country to have a breeding ground where extremism wins out. We must remain vigilant. That's why we're holding this hearing. What keeps me up at night is the thought that these groups who do have a track record and have the absolute motivation to harm Americans, to harm the American way of life, to harm our partners, that's what keeps me up at night, is thinking about those places on earth that we're not thinking about, that we don't have visibility into, and what can we be doing alongside our partners, and especially in Africa, to help prevent those things from metastasizing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning, and I look forward to a good, robust discussion. I now